The dust settled over Virginia City, Nevada, in the autumn of 1873, and Rebecca Owens stood at the edge of the cemetery without making a sound. Her lips pressed together as tightly as the iron gate behind her, unable to scream though every fiber of her being wanted to. She had buried Thomas that morning, laid him in the ground with the September sun beating down mercilessly, and when she opened her mouth to say goodbye, nothing came out. Not a whisper, not a sob, just silence where her voice used to be. The townspeople gathered around her spoke in hushed tones about shock, about grief doing strange things to a person, but Rebecca knew it was more than that. Her voice had left with Thomas, disappeared into whatever place souls went when they departed this earth, and she was left hollow and mute at 24 years old. The weeks that followed were a blur of sympathetic glances and concerned neighbors bringing casseroles she could not taste. Rebecca went through the motions of living, running the small boarding house she and Thomas had built together on the edge of town. She communicated through nods and shakes of her head, through hastily scribbled notes on scraps of paper she kept in her apron pocket. The guests were kind about it, speaking louder as if volume might somehow reach her, not understanding that her hearing was perfectly fine. It was only her voice that had vanished. The boarding house sat on a quiet street where the sounds of the mining operations were distant thunder rather than immediate chaos. Virginia City thrived on silver, the Comstock lode bringing fortune seekers from every corner of the country. Rebecca had arrived here 5 years ago as a 19-year-old bride, starry-eyed and hopeful, believing she and Thomas would build an empire of hospitality. They had succeeded in their small way, creating a respectable establishment known for clean sheets and Rebecca's legendary apple pie. Now the pie tasted like sawdust in her mouth, though the guests still praised it through notes she read with empty eyes. It was on a cold October morning, 6 weeks after the funeral, that Colton Rivers arrived at her door. He stood on the porch with a worn leather bag in one hand and his hat in the other, his brown hair slightly too long and curling at his collar. His eyes were a startling blue, the color of the sky just before dawn, and when he looked at Rebecca, she had the strangest sensation that he could see straight through to all her broken places. "Madam," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in his chest. "I am looking for a room. I understand you have one available." Rebecca nodded and stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. She had posted a notice at the general store just yesterday, needing to fill the corner room on the second floor. Money was growing tight, and though Thomas had been prudent with their savings, she could not run the boarding house forever on what remained. Colton stepped inside, and Rebecca caught the scent of leather and pine and something else, something clean like rain. He was tall, she noticed, having to duck slightly under the door frame, and he moved with a careful grace as though always aware of the space he occupied. She grabbed her slate from the table by the door, the small chalkboard she had taken to carrying everywhere. Her handwriting was neat despite the awkwardness of the medium. "Room is $3 a week, breakfast included, dinner is extra." Colton read the slate and nodded. "That seems fair. I will take it for the month if that suits you." Rebecca erased the message with her sleeve and wrote again. "What brings you to Virginia City?" "Work," he said simply. "I have been hired at the Ophir mine. I start Monday." She showed him upstairs to the corner room, which caught the morning light and had a view of the mountains in the distance. The room was simple but clean, with a bed, a washstand, a wardrobe, and a small desk by the window. Colton set his bag down and turned to face her. "I appreciate this, madam. I will be a quiet tenant. I know how to respect a house." Rebecca nodded again, that perpetual gesture that had become her default communication. She pointed to herself and wrote her name on the slate. Rebecca Owens, widow. She did not know why she added that last word. Perhaps to explain the black dress she wore, the mourning clothes that marked her as someone touched by death. Colton's expression softened, and something that might have been understanding flickered in those blue eyes. Colton Rivers, I am sorry for your loss, Mrs. Owens. She nodded once more and left him to settle in, descending the stairs to the kitchen where she had bread rising and laundry to fold. The boarding house had 4 rooms, and with Colton's arrival, 3 were now occupied. Mr. Chen, a quiet Chinese merchant who kept to himself, had the room at the front. Miss Peterson, a schoolteacher from Sacramento, had the room next to Colton's. And now Colton himself completed the household. As the days passed, Rebecca found herself aware of Colton in ways she had not anticipated. He was true to his word about being a quiet tenant. He left early in the mornings before dawn, walking the 1.5 miles to the mine, and returned as the sun was setting, dusty and tired but always polite. He never failed to nod to her when their paths crossed, and he always cleaned his boots before entering the house. But it was more than his consideration that caught her attention. It was the way he seemed to notice things, how he fixed the loose hinge on the back door without being asked, how he carried in extra firewood when the evenings grew cold, how he helped Miss Peterson with her heavy trunk one afternoon, refusing any thanks with a simple shake of his head. And it was the way he looked at Rebecca, not with pity like so many others, but with a quiet attentiveness that made her feel seen rather than examined. 3 weeks after Colton's arrival, Rebecca was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard raised voices from the front parlor. She hurried out, wiping her hands on her apron, to find Mr. Chen backed against the wall by 2 rough-looking men she did not recognize. They were demanding something, their faces flushed with anger or drink or both. Rebecca stepped forward, positioning herself between Mr. Chen and the strangers, but before she could gesture or write anything, Colton appeared at the top of the stairs. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge, "I believe you are in the wrong place." The larger of the 2 men turned to face him. "This ain't none of your concern, Minor. We got business with the Chinaman. Any business in this house is Mrs. Owens's concern, which makes it mine." Colton descended the stairs slowly, and Rebecca noticed for the first time that he wore a gun belt, the holster sitting comfortably on his hip as though it belonged there. "I suggest you leave peacefully." The tension in the room stretched tight as a wire. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to tell them all to calm down, to explain that violence would solve nothing, but she had no voice to speak with. The second man, smaller but with mean eyes, spat on the floor. "We will be back. Tell your Chinaman friend that debts get collected one way or another." Colton did not move until both men had left, the door slamming behind them. Then he turned to Mr. Chen, who looked shaken but unhurt. "Are you all right?" Mr. Chen nodded quickly. "They believe I owe them money. They are mistaken. My brother, he borrowed from them before he left for San Francisco. They think I will pay his debt." "Will they return?" Colton asked. "Perhaps. Men like that, they do not forget." Colton glanced at Rebecca, who stood frozen with her hand pressed to her throat. She wanted to thank him, wanted to ask if he was all right, wanted to express the gratitude and fear and confusion swirling inside her, but all she could do was mouth the words silently. "You are welcome, madam," Colton said softly, reading her lips or perhaps just understanding. "I will make sure they do not trouble this house again." That evening, after the other tenants had retired, Rebecca found Colton sitting on the back porch, looking out at the darkening mountains. She brought him a cup of coffee, the mug warm in her hands, and sat in the chair beside him. He took the coffee with a nod of thanks, and they sat in companionable silence for a long moment. Finally, Rebecca pulled out a piece of paper from her pocket and wrote by the light spilling from the kitchen window. "You did not have to do that, but thank you." Colton read the note and handed it back to her. "A man does what is right, Mrs. Owens, that is all," she wrote again, her pencil moving quickly across the page. "You wear your gun like you know how to use it." "I do," he admitted, "though I prefer not to. I have seen enough violence in my years to last several lifetimes." Rebecca wanted to ask more, wanted to understand this quiet man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a question she had not known to ask. Instead, she wrote, "Where are you from?" "Texas originally." "Near Austin." "I have been moving around since the war ended. Mining, ranching, whatever work I can find." He paused, taking a sip of coffee. "What about you? You are not from Nevada originally, I would wager." She shook her head and wrote, "Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. My father was a banker. I met Thomas at a church social. We married and came west for adventure." "Did you find it?" Rebecca considered the question, then wrote carefully, "I found happiness. Then I lost it." Colton did not respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. "Grief is a hard companion. I lost someone too a few years back, my brother. He was killed in a dispute over cattle. For a long time I thought the anger and sadness would consume me entirely." She looked at him in the dim light, seeing the shadows that lived in his eyes, and wrote, "How did you survive it?" "I kept moving. Kept working. Kept living even when I did not want to. And eventually one day I woke up and the weight was not quite so heavy. It never disappears entirely, I think. But it becomes something you can carry." Rebecca folded the paper and held it against her chest, feeling tears prick at her eyes. She had cried before, silent tears that left her feeling emptied out and exhausted, but this was different. This felt like understanding, like someone had finally spoken the truth of grief aloud and acknowledged its terrible permanence. Without thinking, she reached out and touched Colton's hand where it rested on the arm of his chair. He went very still, not pulling away but not moving closer either. They sat like that for a heartbeat, 2 heartbeats, and then Rebecca withdrew her hand, suddenly embarrassed by her boldness. But Colton turned to look at her, and in the fading light she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Not pity, not even sympathy exactly, something warmer, something that looked almost like tenderness. "You will find your voice again, Mrs. Owens," he said quietly. "I believe that with certainty." She wished desperately that she could believe him. The next morning, Rebecca woke to find a bouquet of wildflowers on the kitchen table, bright yellows and purples tied with a simple piece of twine. There was no note, but she knew who had left them. The flowers were mountain blooms, the kind that grew in the high meadows away from town, which meant Colton had risen even earlier than usual to pick them. She arranged them in a mason jar and placed them in the window where the morning sun could illuminate their petals. Miss Peterson noticed them at breakfast and smiled. "How lovely," the schoolteacher said. "Did you pick those yourself, Rebecca?" Rebecca shook her head and pointed upstairs where Colton's room was. Miss Peterson raised her eyebrows knowingly. "Mr. Rivers is quite the gentleman, is he not? Always so polite and helpful. You are fortunate to have such a considerate tenant." Rebecca nodded, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. She busied herself with serving the porridge and eggs, avoiding Miss Peterson's curious gaze. When Colton came down for breakfast, he said nothing about the flowers. He simply ate his meal, thanked Rebecca with a nod, and headed out for his day at the mine. But as he passed her in the kitchen doorway, he paused and met her eyes, and the corner of his mouth lifted in the smallest of smiles. Rebecca found herself smiling back, a real smile that felt foreign on her face after so many weeks of numbness. The pattern continued over the following days. Small gestures, quietly offered. Colton fixed the wobbly leg on the dining table. He oiled the squeaky hinge on the front gate. He brought home a bag of apples from the market and left them in the kitchen with a note that read only, "For pies." And Rebecca, who had been going through the motions of living without really feeling alive, began to notice things too. The way Colton's hair curled when it was damp from washing. The way he rolled his sleeves up to his elbows when he worked, revealing forearms tanned and strong from labor. The way his voice sounded when he spoke to the horses that sometimes passed by on the street, gentle and low and coaxing. She began to look forward to the evenings when he would sit on the back porch, and she would join him with coffee or tea, and they would exist in comfortable silence or quiet communication through her written notes. He told her stories about Texas, about growing up on a ranch with 3 brothers and a sister, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the war and the things he had seen, though he spoke of that time sparingly and with visible discomfort. Rebecca wrote to him about Philadelphia, about growing up in a city so different from this dusty mining town, about her mother, who had died when Rebecca was 16, and her father, who had disapproved of her marriage to Thomas, but had given his blessing anyway because he loved her. About the journey west, the endless prairie and the frightening beauty of the mountains, the moment she had first seen Virginia City and thought it looked like a pile of matchsticks clinging to a hillside. "You miss it?" Colton asked one evening. "Philadelphia." Rebecca considered, then wrote, "I miss who I was there. Young and naive and believing the world was full of simple choices." "The world has no simple choices," Colton agreed. "Only hard ones we must make anyway." "What was the hardest choice you ever made?" Colton was quiet for so long that Rebecca thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Leaving my family's ranch after the war. My father wanted me to stay to help rebuild what we had lost. But I could not remain in a place filled with ghosts, so I left, and I have been leaving ever since. Do you regret it? Some days. But then I think about the things I have seen, the places I have been, the people I have met." He looked at her directly, holding her gaze. "And I think perhaps all those leavings led me exactly where I needed to be." Rebecca's heart did something complicated in her chest, a flutter and a squeeze that left her breathless. She looked away, suddenly too aware of how close they were sitting, how the night air had grown cool and intimate around them. She wrote quickly, her handwriting less neat than usual. "I should check on the bread dough." "Of course," Colton said, but there was something in his voice, a warmth that had not been there before, or perhaps had been there all along, and she was only now allowing herself to hear it. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow to the mountains and ice to the streets of Virginia City. Rebecca ordered extra firewood and began preparing heartier meals, stews and roasts that filled the boarding house with rich aromas. The tenants gathered in the parlor more often now, drawn by the warmth of the fire and the sense of companionship that seemed to have grown among them. Even Mr. Chen, usually so reserved, began to share stories about his childhood in Canton and his journey to America. Miss Peterson entertained them with tales of her students' antics, and Colton, when persuaded, would play the harmonica he kept in his room, filling the evening with melodies both mournful and sweet. Rebecca would sit in her chair by the fire, mending clothes or knitting, listening to the music and the voices and feeling something she had not felt since Thomas died. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of contentment, a sense that life continued and could still hold moments of beauty. One evening in early December, a fierce storm rolled through, bringing wind that howled around the corners of the house and snow that fell so thickly the street disappeared from view. The tenants huddled close to the fire, and Rebecca brought out extra blankets and hot cocoa she had made with precious chocolate and sugar. The wind rattled the windows, and Miss Peterson jumped, looking nervous. "I do hope the roof holds." "This house has weathered worse storms," Colton assured her. "Mrs. Owens keeps it in good repair." Rebecca appreciated the confidence in his voice, though she shared some of Miss Peterson's anxiety. The boarding house was sturdy but old, and she worried about the weight of snow accumulating on the roof. As if reading her thoughts, Colton stood and stretched. "I should check the attic, make sure there are no leaks starting." Rebecca set aside her knitting and stood as well, pointing to herself to indicate she would go with him. "It is cold up there," Colton warned, but she simply grabbed a shawl and headed for the stairs. The attic was indeed cold, the temperature barely warmer than outside. Colton lit a lantern and held it high, examining the rafters and the underside of the roof. Rebecca followed behind him, her breath misting in the frigid air. They moved slowly through the cramped space, ducking under beams and stepping carefully over the joists. Colton paused occasionally to press his hand against the roof boards, checking for moisture or weak spots. "Everything looks sound," he said finally, lowering the lantern. "You have nothing to worry about." Rebecca nodded, relieved, but when she turned to head back toward the stairs, her foot slipped on a loose board. She gasped silently and stumbled, her arms windmilling as she tried to catch her balance. Colton moved faster than she would have thought possible, dropping the lantern onto a nearby crate and catching her around the waist. He pulled her against him, steadying her, and they stood frozen like that for a breathless moment. Rebecca's hands had come to rest on his chest, and she could feel his heart beating beneath her palms, strong and quick. He was warm despite the cold, solid and real, and when she looked up at him, his face was very close to hers. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough. She nodded, unable to look away from his eyes, from the concern and something else she saw there, something that made her own heart race. Colton's hands were still on her waist, and she became acutely aware that they were alone, that the storm outside had isolated them in this small, cold space where the rest of the world felt very far away. "Rebecca," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. It sounded different in his mouth, intimate and careful, like something precious. She wanted to say his name back, wanted to tell him that she had been noticing him, that his kindness had become the best part of her days, that somewhere in the past weeks her grief had made room for something else, something bright and terrifying and wonderful. But she had no voice, so instead she did the only thing she could think to do. She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. For a heartbeat, Colton went absolutely still. Then his arms tightened around her and he was kissing her back, gentle and sure, his mouth warm against hers. The kiss was sweet and searching, a question and an answer all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Colton rested his forehead against hers. "I have been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "But I did not know if you were ready, if you could ever think of me as more than just a tenant." Rebecca pulled back enough to look at him, then smiled and shook her head. She touched his face with her fingertips, traced the line of his jaw, trying to communicate everything she felt without words. Colton caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "We should go back down before they worry, but Rebecca, I need you to know that I am not going anywhere, not unless you want me to." She shook her head emphatically, her eyes bright, and Colton smiled, a real smile that transformed his serious face into something boyish and hopeful. They descended from the attic together, and if the other tenants noticed that they stood a little closer than before, that their glances lingered a little longer, no one said anything. But Miss Peterson had a knowing smile on her face, and even Mr. Chen seemed pleased when he looked between them. The days that followed were different. Colton still went to work at the mine, still came home dusty and tired, but now when he entered the house, his eyes sought Rebecca first. And she found herself watching for him, listening for his step on the porch, feeling her heart lift when he appeared. They took walks together on Sundays when the weather permitted, bundled against the cold, exploring the edges of town. Colton held her arm as they navigated icy patches, and Rebecca leaned into his warmth, marveling at how natural it felt to be close to him. On one such walk, they climbed to a high point overlooking Virginia City and stood looking down at the town spread out below them like a toy village. Colton pulled out a small notebook and pencil from his pocket and handed them to Rebecca. She looked at him questioningly. "I want to know what you are thinking," he explained. "I love the silence we share, but I want to know your thoughts too." Rebecca took the notebook and wrote, "I am thinking that I never expected to feel this way again. Happy, hopeful. After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over forever." Colton read the words and nodded slowly. "Thomas was a fortunate man to have been loved by you, but Rebecca, you deserve to be happy. You deserve to live fully, not just exist in the shadow of grief." She wrote again, her hand shaking slightly. "I feel guilty sometimes, like being happy means I did not love him enough. Grief and love can coexist with new happiness," Colton said firmly. "Thomas would not want you to stop living. And Rebecca, what I feel for you, it does not erase what you had with him. It is something different, something new. You have room in your heart for both the past and the future." Tears spilled down Rebecca's cheeks, and she nodded, believing him because she wanted to, because she needed to. Colton pulled her into his arms and held her while she cried, silent sobs that shook her whole body, releasing months of pent-up emotion. When she finally calmed, he wiped her tears with his thumbs and kissed her forehead. "I love you, Rebecca Owens. I think I started loving you the first day I saw you, standing in that doorway looking lost and brave at the same time." Rebecca pressed her hand to his chest, over his heart, then to her own chest. The gesture was clear even without words. "I love you too." They walked back to town hand in hand, and Rebecca felt lighter than she had in months, as though some great burden had been lifted from her shoulders. Christmas came, bringing with it a festive spirit that even reached the boarding house. Rebecca decorated the parlor with pine boughs and candles, and baked cookies that filled the house with the scent of cinnamon and sugar. She had saved money to buy small gifts for each of the tenants, practical things like warm socks and new handkerchiefs. But for Colton, she had made something special. She had knitted him a scarf in a deep blue that matched his eyes, working on it in the evenings after everyone had gone to bed, her fingers moving by lamplight. On Christmas morning, they exchanged gifts in the parlor. Miss Peterson received a new set of hair combs with delight. Mr. Chen was clearly touched by the warm gloves Rebecca had chosen for him. When Rebecca handed Colton the wrapped scarf, his eyes widened. He unwrapped it slowly, running his fingers over the soft wool, and when he looked up at her, there was wonder in his expression. "Rebecca, this is beautiful. You made this," she nodded, feeling shy suddenly. "I will treasure it always." He wrapped the scarf around his neck, and it did indeed bring out the blue of his eyes. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I have something for you as well." Rebecca took the box with trembling fingers and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, was a silver locket on a delicate chain. She lifted it carefully and opened the locket to find it empty, waiting to be filled. "I thought you might want to put a picture of Thomas in one side," Colton said quietly. "And perhaps, someday, if you wanted, something of us in the other. Past and future together." Rebecca looked at him through fresh tears, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness, by his understanding of her heart. She handed him the locket and turned, lifting her hair so he could fasten it around her neck. When she turned back, she threw her arms around him, hugging him tightly, feeling his arms come around her in return. "Merry Christmas, Rebecca," he whispered against her hair. She pulled back and mouthed the words, "Merry Christmas, Colton." The new year of 1874 arrived with a week of clear, brutally cold weather. The mine where Colton worked was shut down temporarily due to frozen equipment, so he spent his days helping Rebecca around the boarding house. They fell into an easy domestic rhythm, working side by side to prepare meals and clean rooms and manage the daily tasks of running the establishment. Miss Peterson mentioned one evening that it was almost like they were married, then blushed and apologized for her forwardness. But the comment planted a seed in Rebecca's mind, and she found herself imagining what it might be like to truly be Colton's wife, to share not just a house but a life. The thought both thrilled and frightened her. She had been a wife before, and widowhood had nearly destroyed her. Could she risk that pain again? Could she open herself up to the possibility of losing someone else she loved? But when she looked at Colton, at the gentle patience in his eyes and the strength in his hands, she thought perhaps she could. Perhaps love was always a risk worth taking. On a cold January evening after the other tenants had retired, Colton asked Rebecca to sit with him in the parlor. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in a warm glow. "I need to talk to you about something," he said, his voice serious. Rebecca felt a flutter of anxiety and pulled out her notebook, ready to write. "I have been offered a position," Colton continued. "A good one. There is a ranch about 30 miles north of here, near Reno. The owner needs a foreman, someone to help manage his operation. It is more money than I make at the mine and steadier work." Rebecca waited, her pencil poised over paper, her heart suddenly heavy. Was he leaving? Colton reached over and took her free hand. "I told him I would only take the position if it came with a house. A foreman's house, big enough for a family." He paused, his eyes searching her face. "Rebecca, I want you to come with me, as my wife." Rebecca's breath caught. She stared at him, unable to move, unable to process what he was saying. "I know it is fast," Colton said quickly. "I know you might need more time. But Rebecca, I love you. I want to build a life with you, a real life. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to fill that house with laughter and children and all the things that make a life worth living." Rebecca's hand shook as she wrote, "What about the boarding house?" "We could sell it," Colton suggested. "Or lease it to someone else to run. You have built something good here, Rebecca, but you do not have to be bound to it forever. Not if you want something different." She wrote again, faster now. "I am afraid." "I know, so am I." Colton lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "But I am more afraid of living without you than I am of anything else this world might throw at us." Rebecca looked into his eyes, those blue eyes that had seen so much and still held hope, and she realized that her fear was no match for what she felt for this man. He had loved her in her silence, had been patient and kind and steady. He had helped her remember that life continued, that happiness was still possible. She pulled her hand from his and wrote carefully, "Yes, I will marry you." Colton's face broke into a smile so bright it rivaled the sun. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, and Rebecca kissed him back with all the emotion she could not speak aloud. When they finally broke apart, both laughing, Colton said, "We can marry whenever you are ready. Tomorrow, next month, next year, I will wait as long as you need." Rebecca shook her head and wrote, "Soon. I do not want to wait." They decided on a wedding in 3 weeks, enough time to make arrangements, but not so long that the waiting would become unbearable. Rebecca wrote to her father in Philadelphia, knowing he could not possibly arrive in time but wanting him to know. She was surprised when a telegram arrived a week later with his blessing and a promise to send a gift. Miss Peterson and Mr. Chen were delighted by the news, and they helped Rebecca prepare for the wedding. Miss Peterson offered to make Rebecca a new dress, having some skill with a needle. Mr. Chen promised to handle a special dinner to celebrate after the ceremony. The town's reverend agreed to perform the ceremony in the small church at the edge of Virginia City. It would be a simple affair, with just the boarding house tenants and a few of Colton's friends from the mine in attendance. As the day approached, Rebecca found herself both excited and nervous. She still had not regained her voice, and the thought of a voiceless bride seemed strange and sad. But Colton assured her it did not matter, that he would speak their vows for both of them if needed. "Your silence is part of you right now," he told her. "I love all of you, Rebecca." Voice or no voice. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue unmarred by clouds. Rebecca woke early and bathed, then allowed Miss Peterson to help her dress. The gown was simple but elegant, made of cream-colored silk that Miss Peterson had somehow acquired. It fit perfectly, nipping in at the waist and flowing to the floor in soft folds. Miss Peterson styled Rebecca's dark hair, pinning it up and leaving a few curls to frame her face. She fastened the silver locket Colton had given her around Rebecca's neck, the weight of it comforting. "You look beautiful," Miss Peterson said, tears in her eyes. "Thomas would be happy for you. I truly believe that." Rebecca hugged the schoolteacher, grateful for her kindness and friendship. At the church, Colton waited at the altar in a new suit, his hair neatly combed, looking more handsome than Rebecca had ever seen him. His face when he saw her walking down the aisle was worth all the nervousness, all the fear. He looked at her like she was the answer to every prayer he had ever spoken. The ceremony was brief. Reverend Morrison spoke about love and commitment, about the sacred bond of marriage. When it came time for the vows, he turned to Colton first. "Do you, Colton Rivers, take Rebecca Owens to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Colton said firmly, his voice steady and sure. Reverend Morrison turned to Rebecca. "And do you, Rebecca Owens, take Colton Rivers to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Rebecca opened her mouth, wanting desperately to say the words aloud, to speak her commitment in her own voice. But nothing came out, just as she had known nothing would. Tears of frustration pricked at her eyes. Colton squeezed her hand gently, his expression understanding. "It is all right," he murmured. But Rebecca shook her head. It was not all right. This was her wedding day, the day she was promising herself to this wonderful man, and she could not even speak her vows. She closed her eyes, gathering herself, thinking of everything Colton had done for her, everything he meant to her. She thought of Thomas and the love they had shared, and instead of guilt, she felt only gratitude that she had been blessed to love deeply twice in her life. She thought of her voice, locked somewhere inside her, hidden behind walls of grief and pain. And she thought about Colton's words from weeks ago. "You will find your voice again." Rebecca opened her eyes and looked at Colton, at his dear face, at the love shining in his eyes. She took a deep breath. "I do." The words came out as a whisper, rusty and rough from disuse, but they were audible, real. Her voice, Colton's eyes widened in shock. Around them, the small gathering gasped. Rebecca's hands flew to her throat, her own eyes wide with disbelief. "I do," she said again, louder this time, tears streaming down her face. "I do, I do, I do." Colton pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could hardly breathe, and she felt his shoulders shaking with emotion. When he pulled back, his own face was wet with tears. "Say something else," he said, his voice rough. "Say anything." "I love you," Rebecca said, marveling at the sound of her own voice, at the way the words felt forming in her mouth. "Colton, I love you so much." He laughed through his tears and kissed her, and the small church erupted in applause and cheers. Reverend Morrison, beaming, pronounced them husband and wife, though the words were barely audible over the celebration. The dinner that followed at the boarding house was joyous and loud, with Rebecca talking almost nonstop, making up for months of silence. She told stories and laughed and sang snatches of songs she remembered, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I cannot believe it," she said for the 10th time, touching her throat in wonder. "I thought I had lost it forever." "I knew you would find it again," Colton said, pulling her close. "I just did not know it would happen today. What a gift, Rebecca, what a perfect gift." "It was you," she said, looking up at him. "You brought it back. Your love, your patience, your belief in me. You gave me a reason to speak again." They spent their wedding night at the boarding house in Colton's room that would be theirs for only a few more days. In the morning, they would begin packing, preparing for their move to the ranch near Reno. But for now, they existed in a bubble of happiness, wrapped in each other's arms, Rebecca whispering everything she had been unable to say for months. She told him about the first time she had noticed him, how his kindness had pierced through her grief. She told him about the day she realized she was falling in love with him, how terrified she had been. She told him about Thomas, about their marriage and his death, speaking the memories aloud and finding that doing so did not hurt as much as she had feared. And Colton listened, holding her, responding with his own stories and confessions. They talked through most of the night, making up for all the conversations they had conducted in silence or through written notes. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity. Rebecca arranged for the boarding house to be leased to a respectable couple from Sacramento who had been looking for such an opportunity. She packed their belongings, sorted through what to keep and what to leave behind. Miss Peterson and Mr. Chen prepared to find new lodgings, though both promised to visit once Rebecca and Colton were settled. On their last evening in Virginia City, Rebecca and Colton walked to the cemetery together. Rebecca had avoided the place since Thomas's funeral, unable to face it, but now she felt ready. They stood before Thomas's headstone, simple and clean, and Rebecca placed a bouquet of dried flowers on the ground. "Thank you," she said softly to the stone, to the memory of the man she had loved. "Thank you for the years we had together, for bringing me to this place, for everything you gave me. I will always love you, but I am ready to move forward now. I hope wherever you are, you understand." Colton stood a respectful distance away, giving her privacy, but when Rebecca reached for his hand, he came immediately to her side. "He was a good man," Colton said. "I wish I could have known him." "He would have liked you," Rebecca said with certainty. "He always appreciated honesty and kindness." They stood in silence for a few more minutes, and then Rebecca said, "I am ready to go home now." Colton smiled. "To the boarding house." "No," Rebecca said, squeezing his hand. "Home is wherever you are. Let us go to our future." The journey to the ranch near Reno took 2 days by wagon, traveling through country that was beautiful and stark. The Truckee River wound alongside the road for much of the journey, and they stopped to let the horses drink and to stretch their legs. Rebecca marveled at the landscape, so different from either Philadelphia or Virginia City. The mountains rose dramatic and snow-capped against the blue sky, and the valleys spread out in shades of brown and green and gold. Hawks circled overhead, and once they saw a herd of wild horses running free across an open plain. "It is beautiful," Rebecca said, and Colton agreed. "I think you will love the ranch," he told her. "It is peaceful there, away from the noise and chaos of the mining towns." There is room to breathe, room to build something lasting. The ranch, when they finally arrived, exceeded Rebecca's expectations. The main house was a sprawling structure of wood and stone, clearly well maintained. Behind it stood barns and outbuildings, corrals filled with horses and cattle. The land stretched out in every direction, thousands of acres of range and meadow. The foreman's house was smaller but comfortable, a cozy two-story building with a wide front porch and a stone chimney. Inside, the furniture was simple but sturdy, and there were windows on every side that let in abundant light. "What do you think?" Colton asked nervously as Rebecca walked through the rooms. "I think it is perfect," she said honestly. "I can already imagine us here building our life together." They spent the first few weeks settling in and learning the rhythms of ranch life. Colton worked long days helping the owner manage the operation, and Rebecca focused on making their house a home. She planted a small garden, anticipating spring. She sewed curtains for the windows. She learned to cook on the large cast iron stove in the kitchen, experimenting with recipes and occasionally burning things in the process. The ranch owner, a gruff but kind man named Samuel Hayes, seemed pleased with Colton's work. His wife, Martha, befriended Rebecca and taught her about ranch life, about preserving food and managing livestock, and all the skills Rebecca had never needed in Philadelphia or in the boarding house. Winter deepened, and then began to loosen its grip. By March, the snow was melting from the valleys, and green shoots appeared in Rebecca's garden. She and Colton had settled into a comfortable married life, learning each other's habits and preferences, occasionally disagreeing but always finding their way back to understanding. One evening in early April, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Rebecca said, "I am pregnant." Colton went very still beside her. Then he turned to look at her, his eyes wide. "Truly, truly," she confirmed, smiling at his expression. "I am almost certain. I have been feeling different for a few weeks now, and this morning I was sick. Martha says those are the signs." Colton let out a whoop of joy and swept her into his arms, spinning her around on the porch until she was dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, he immediately looked concerned. "Are you all right? Should you be standing? Do you need to sit down? Should I get Martha?" Rebecca laughed and took his face in her hands. "Colton, I am fine. Pregnant women do not break, but yes, I am very happy. Are you happy?" "Happy does not begin to cover it," he said fervently. "Rebecca, you have given me so much already, and now a child, our child." He shook his head in wonder. "I am the most fortunate man alive." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and summer. Rebecca's belly grew round, and she found herself filled with energy and purpose. She continued working in her garden, though Colton fretted about her doing too much. She helped Martha with the ranch's kitchen garden and learned to can vegetables and fruits for the winter. As her due date approached in the fall, both she and Colton grew increasingly nervous and excited. Martha promised to help with the birth, having delivered many babies in her years on the ranch. The nearest doctor was in Reno, a 2-hour ride away, but Martha assured them that most births did not require a doctor's intervention. On a cool October morning, Rebecca woke to cramping pains and knew her time had come. Colton rode immediately to fetch Martha, who arrived with her medical bag and a calm, efficient demeanor. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the day and into the night. Rebecca had not anticipated how much it would hurt, how exhausting it would be. But Colton stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, speaking encouragement when she thought she could not continue. "You are the strongest person I know," he told her as another contraction racked her body. "You survived grief that would have destroyed lesser people. You found your voice again through sheer will. You can do this, Rebecca. I believe in you. And finally, as dawn was breaking on a new day, their son was born. He came into the world screaming lustily, his face red and his fists waving, and Rebecca collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but elated. Martha cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket, then placed him in Rebecca's arms. Rebecca looked down at the tiny face, at the dark hair and the eyes that seemed to look right at her, and felt her heart expand to accommodate this new, overwhelming love. "He is perfect," she whispered. Colton, who had tears streaming down his face, carefully touched their son's tiny hand. The baby immediately grasped his finger, holding tight, and Colton let out a choked laugh. "He is strong, just like his mother." They named him Thomas Samuel Rivers, honoring both the husband Rebecca had lost and the ranch owner who had given them this opportunity. Little Tommy, as they called him, had his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. He was a good baby, crying only when hungry or tired, and he brought a joy to the house that Rebecca had not known was possible. The months that followed were exhausting but wonderful. Rebecca learned to function on little sleep, to nurse and change and soothe the baby through long nights. Colton helped whenever he could, rocking Tommy when Rebecca needed to rest, pacing the floor during colicky evenings. The ranch thrived under Colton's management, and Samuel Hayes made it clear he considered himself fortunate to have found such a capable foreman. As winter approached again, Hayes called Colton into his office. "I am getting older," the rancher said bluntly. "Martha and I have no children to inherit this place. I have been thinking that when the time comes, I would like to sell the ranch to someone who loves it the way I do, someone who would care for it properly." Colton was stunned. "Sir, I do not have the capital to purchase a ranch of this size." "I know that," Hayes said, "but we could work out terms. You could buy it over time, paying from the profits. You have already proven yourself more than capable. I would rather sell to you for a fair price paid over years than to some stranger who might ruin what I have built." Colton thanked him and promised to discuss it with Rebecca. That evening, as they sat by the fire with Tommy sleeping in his cradle, Colton explained the offer. Rebecca listened carefully, then said, "Do you want to own this ranch, to put down permanent roots here?" "I do," Colton admitted. "I love this place, Rebecca. I love the work, the land, the life we are building, but it is a huge commitment and I will not make this decision without you." Rebecca looked around their comfortable house, thought about the friends they had made, the community they were becoming part of. She thought about Tommy growing up here, learning to ride and work the land, inheriting something meaningful. "Yes," she said firmly, "let us do it. Let us make this our home for the rest of our lives." Over the next several years, they worked toward that goal. Colton managed the ranch brilliantly, increasing profits and expanding operations. Rebecca became known in the community for her kindness and her skill with herbs and remedies, often helping neighbors with illnesses and injuries. Tommy grew into a bright, energetic toddler, and then into a curious young boy who followed his father everywhere. When Tommy was 4 years old, Rebecca became pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and the birth was easier. They welcomed a daughter into the world, a tiny girl with her father's blue eyes and a temperament as sunny as a summer day. They named her Sarah, and Tommy was instantly devoted to his little sister, appointing himself her protector. By the time Tommy was 8 and Sarah was 4, Colton and Rebecca had saved enough to make the final payment on the ranch. Samuel and Martha Hayes moved to a smaller house in Reno to enjoy their retirement, and the ranch officially became the property of Colton and Rebecca Rivers. They held a celebration, inviting all their friends and neighbors, and Rebecca looked around at the gathered crowd with deep satisfaction. This was the life she had built after losing everything. This was the happiness that had seemed impossible during those dark months after Thomas's death. That evening, after the guests had departed and the children were asleep, Rebecca and Colton sat on their porch, just as they had so many times before. "You remember the first time we sat together like this?" Rebecca asked. "At the boarding house in Virginia City." "I remember every moment," Colton said, pulling her close. "I remember thinking you were the saddest person I had ever seen, and I remember wanting more than anything to take that sadness away." "You did," Rebecca said softly. "You loved me when I could not speak, when I was lost in grief. You were patient and kind and everything I needed. You saved me, Colton." "We saved each other," Colton corrected. "You gave me a reason to stop running, to put down roots and build something lasting. You gave me a family, a purpose, a home. I love you more today than I did the day we married, and I loved you desperately then." Rebecca turned to kiss him, a slow, sweet kiss that held all the years of love and partnership between them. When they broke apart, she rested her head on his shoulder and looked out at their land, at the mountains dark against the starlit sky. "I am grateful," she said, "for all of it. The joy and the sorrow, the loss and the finding, it all led me here to you, to this life. I would not change a single thing." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars, and Rebecca thought about how far she had come. From the grief-stricken widow who had lost her voice to the contented wife and mother she was now. From silence to speech, from sorrow to joy, from endings to new beginnings. The years continued to unfold like the pages of a beloved book. Tommy grew tall and strong, eventually joining his father in running the ranch. Sarah blossomed into a beautiful young woman with her mother's kindness and her father's determination. And Rebecca and Colton weathered the storms of life together, their love deepening with each passing season. When Rebecca was 42, she stood in the same small church in Virginia City, where she had married Colton 20 years earlier, this time watching Tommy marry his sweetheart, a bright-eyed girl named Emma from a neighboring ranch. As the young couple spoke their vows, both with strong, clear voices, Rebecca felt Colton squeeze her hand. "What are you thinking?" he whispered. "I am thinking about how we spoke our vows here, and how I found my voice on our wedding day. I am thinking about how blessed we have been." "We have indeed," Colton agreed. "And we still have many years ahead of us, God willing." They did have many years, years filled with grandchildren and continued prosperity. The ranch became one of the most successful in the region, known for quality livestock and fair dealing. Rebecca's garden expanded into a small orchard, producing apples and pears that she turned into preserves and pies that won ribbons at the county fair. Sarah eventually married a kind young man who was a teacher in Reno, and they settled nearby, giving Rebecca and Colton 4 more grandchildren to dote upon. The ranch house was often filled with the sounds of children playing and family gatherings, exactly as Colton had once imagined. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Colton took Rebecca back to Virginia City, to the cemetery where Thomas was buried. Rebecca had visited the grave periodically over the years, bringing flowers and telling Thomas about her life, about the children and the ranch and all the blessings that had come her way. "Hello, Thomas," she said softly, placing fresh flowers on the headstone. "I brought Colton with me today. I wanted you both to know how grateful I am. Thomas, you gave me 5 wonderful years and taught me how to love deeply. And Colton, you showed me that love could bloom again from the ashes of grief. I have been blessed beyond measure to have loved and been loved by 2 such remarkable men." Colton stood with his arm around her waist, and Rebecca leaned into his warmth. This man who had loved her through silence and speech, through sorrows and joys, through all the years that had built their life together. As they walked back to their wagon, Rebecca said, "Do you remember telling me once that grief was something we carry, but that eventually the weight becomes bearable?" "I do." "You were right. I will always carry the grief of losing Thomas, but I carry so much more now. I carry our love, our children, our life together. The weight of joy far exceeds the weight of sorrow." They drove home to their ranch as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Rebecca looked at Colton's profile, at the lines time had carved around his eyes and mouth, at the gray threading through his hair, and she thought he had never been more handsome. "What?" he asked, catching her staring. "I am just thinking how lucky I am," she said. "How grateful." "The luck was all mine," Colton replied. "Showing up at your boarding house that day was the best decision I ever made." "It was fate," Rebecca said with certainty. "It brought you to me when I needed you most. It gave us this beautiful life." In the years that followed, they settled into the peaceful rhythm of their later life together. They spent more time with their grandchildren, teaching them to ride and garden and appreciate the land. They sat on their porch in the evenings, sometimes talking, sometimes silent, always comfortable in each other's presence. Rebecca's voice, which had returned so miraculously on her wedding day, remained strong. She used it to sing lullabies to her grandchildren, to tell stories around the fire, to speak words of love and encouragement to her family. And she never took it for granted, remembering those months of silence and the lessons they had taught her about resilience and hope. On a warm summer evening when Rebecca was 62, she and Colton celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a party that lasted into the night, with music and dancing and more food than anyone could possibly eat. As the celebration wound down and the younger grandchildren fell asleep on blankets under the stars, Tommy stood and raised his glass. "To my parents," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You built something remarkable here. Not just this ranch, but a family, a legacy of love and hard work and kindness. You taught us that grief does not have to destroy us, that love can heal even the deepest wounds, that persistence and dedication create lasting success. Sarah and I, all of us, we are who we are because of your example. Thank you for everything." Rebecca had tears streaming down her face, and Colton's eyes were bright as he stood and raised his own glass. "To family," he said simply. "To love, to the years behind us and the years still to come." They drank, and then the party truly began to disperse, children being carried to beds, couples saying their goodnights. Rebecca and Colton stood on their porch, waving as wagons departed until finally they were alone under the stars. 40 years, Rebecca marveled. "It feels like both a lifetime and no time at all." "I would live it all again exactly the same," Colton said, pulling her into his arms. "Every moment with you has been a gift." They danced on the porch with no music but the wind through the trees and the distant sound of the river. Rebecca rested her head against Colton's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and felt peace settle over her like a warm blanket. This was what she had needed all along, even during those dark months when she thought she would never be whole again. Love, family, purpose. A reason to speak, to live, to hope. Colton had given her all of that and more, had loved her through silence and speech, through grief and joy, through every season of their lives together. The years continued their inexorable march. Rebecca and Colton watched their grandchildren grow and begin families of their own. The ranch passed primarily into Tommy's capable hands, though Colton remained active in its management well into his 70s. Rebecca's orchard flourished, and she spent happy hours among her trees, pruning and harvesting, making the preserves that had become sought after throughout the region. They traveled occasionally, taking the train to San Francisco to see the ocean, visiting relatives in Texas and Pennsylvania. But they always returned home to their ranch, to the mountains and the wide sky, to the land that had witnessed their love story unfold. On a crisp autumn morning when Rebecca was 68, she and Colton rode out together to a high meadow, a place they had discovered in their first year on the ranch. The aspen trees blazed gold in the sunlight, and the air was sharp and clean and full of the promise of approaching winter. They dismounted and stood at the edge of the meadow, looking out over the valley below where their ranch spread out like a patchwork quilt. "You remember our first ride up here?" Colton asked. "I remember everything," Rebecca said. "I remember thinking this was the most beautiful place I had ever seen. I remember feeling hopeful for the first time since Thomas died. I remember looking at you and realizing I was falling in love." "I was already long gone by then," Colton admitted with a smile. "I think I fell in love with you the moment you opened the door of the boarding house. You looked so lost and so determined at the same time. I wanted to know you, to understand you, to help you if I could." "You did more than help me," Rebecca said, turning to face him fully. "You gave me my life back. You gave me reasons to speak again, reasons to laugh and hope and believe in happiness. Colton, you are the best thing that ever happened to me." He cupped her face in his weathered hands, his blue eyes still as bright as they had been when he was a young man. "And you are mine. My greatest adventure, my deepest love, my home. Thank you, Rebecca, for saying yes all those years ago. Thank you for building this life with me." They kissed there in the golden meadow, surrounded by the beauty of the land they loved, and Rebecca felt the same flutter of joy she had felt on their wedding day. Time had changed them, aged them, but it had not diminished their love. If anything, the years had strengthened it, adding depth and dimension, weaving their lives together so tightly that she could not imagine where she ended and he began. They lived for many more years, blessed with good health and the constant presence of family. Their great-grandchildren called them Nana and Papa, climbing into their laps for stories and cookies, begging to hear tales of the old days. Rebecca told them about Philadelphia and Virginia City, about silent months and found voices, about courage and love and the power of second chances. When Rebecca was 76, Colton became ill with pneumonia during a harsh winter. Rebecca nursed him through it, sitting by his bedside through long nights, refusing to leave him. And when he recovered, thin and weak but alive, they held each other and wept with relief and gratitude. "I am not ready to leave you yet," Colton said, his voice hoarse. "We still have too much living to do." "Then do not leave," Rebecca commanded. "Stay with me. We have a deal, remember, forever." "Forever," he agreed. They kept that promise for 7 more years, years that were gentle and sweet and full of quiet contentment. They watched their family grow and thrive. They saw the ranch prosper under the 4th generation of management. They sat on their porch and held hands and talked or stayed silent, whatever the moment called for. On a warm June evening when Rebecca was 83, she sat with Colton on their porch as the sun set over the mountains. His hand was in hers, warm and familiar, and she felt utterly at peace. "I love you," she said, the words as natural as breathing after 60 years of speaking them. "I love you too," Colton replied. "Always have, always will." They watched the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky, and Rebecca thought about the long, winding path that had brought her here. From grief and silence to joy and speech, from endings to beginnings, from the young widow who thought she would never speak again to the old woman whose voice had told thousands of stories. She thought about Thomas, her first love, who had brought her west and given her 5 good years. She thought about the day Colton arrived at her door, how she had not known he would become her salvation, her future, her forever. She thought about their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the family that had grown from their love. And she thought about her voice, lost and then found, and how it had become the instrument through which she had spoken her greatest truths. I love you, thank you, yes, the simple words that built a life. Colton, she said softly. Yes, my love, thank you for loving me, for waiting for me, for giving me everything. He squeezed her hand. Thank you for saying yes, for speaking again, for being mine. They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them, two old people who had lived and loved and built something lasting. And if the stars shone a little brighter that night, if the wind whispered through the trees with extra gentleness, perhaps it was the universe's way of acknowledging a love story well told, a life well lived, a promise well kept. Years later, when Rebecca was 91 and Colton was 93, they were still together on their ranch, now surrounded by 5 generations of family. They moved more slowly, spoke more quietly, but their love remained constant, a steady flame that had burned for nearly 7 decades. They died within hours of each other on a snowy December morning, holding hands in the bed they had shared for 68 years. Their children gathered around them, and Rebecca's last words, spoken in a whisper but clear, were, "What a beautiful life we made." And Colton's last breath was spent saying, "Forever, my love, forever." They were buried side by side on a hillside overlooking the ranch, beneath twin headstones that read simply their names and dates and the words "beloved," forever together. And though they were gone, their legacy remained in the family they had built, the land they had nurtured, and the love story they had lived. The ranch continued to thrive for generations, a testament to Colton and Rebecca's hard work and vision. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light hit just right, people swore they could see 2 figures on the porch of the old foreman's house, sitting close together, hands intertwined, watching the sunset over the mountains they had loved so well. The story of Rebecca and Colton became legend in the family, told and retold to each new generation. The widow who lost her voice and found it again on her wedding day. The cowboy who loved her in silence until she spoke again. A love story born from grief and patience, built on kindness and hope, lasting through all the years of their long, blessed lives. And in the end, it was a story of healing and second chances, of finding home in another person, of building something lasting from the ashes of loss. It was a story that proved grief does not have to be the end, that voices can be recovered, that love can bloom even in the hardest soil, and that forever is real when 2 people commit to making it so. Their great-great-grandchildren still visit the graves on the hillside, bringing flowers and telling Rebecca and Colton about their lives, about the ranch that still stands, about the family that continues to grow. And though the world has changed beyond recognition from the Wild West days of Virginia City and silver mines and Foreman houses, the truth at the heart of Rebecca and Colton's story remains unchanged. Love heals. Patience transforms. And sometimes, when grief steals your voice, the right person will love you in silence until you find the strength to speak again. And when you do, when those first words emerge after long quiet, they will be the most important words you ever say. I do. I love you, forever. The words that built a life. The words that healed a heart. The words that proved that even in the hardest times, in the wildest places, love endures and hope survives, and joy can be found again. This was the legacy of Rebecca and Colton Rivers, a love story written across nearly 7 decades of shared life, remembered and cherished by all who came after them, a testament to the power of patience, the strength of love, and the miracle of second chances in the untamed beauty of the American West.